I wanted to go through the Unity editor so you'll get an idea of how things work and how we're going to set up things for our games for the quarter. If you look here, this sort of looks just like, Unity did if you're used to that. But, we just have windows in different places. These things can be moved around too. I'm fine with the way it's set up right now. So I'm just going to sort of leave it as it is. But the most important thing to notice is that we have this content browser here, and we have a content folder. And this sort of area is going to be where all of your project folders and files live. But in addition, you can add content to your game through here. So using add new. So for example, later on when we want to add something, with C++ or something like that, we can just click on this add new button and it'll let us do that. We can add whole content and feature packs. So for example, you'll notice that my content directory is pretty empty, and I could add some kind of like setup for different kinds of games. I can come and add my startup content, which doesn't appear to have, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And then once I do that, what I'll see is that the starter content all lives here in different folders. Okay, and it gives you a little preview here of the different sorts of things that you can do. Now, for our class, what we want to do is create a new folder, and we're going to call this labs. And the reason is that starter content, because if you set up your git ignore properly, this starter content is not going to get uploaded to the server. So if you put anything here or change anything that belongs in here, it's just not going to get uploaded and we won't see it working. Instead, you want to make sure that anything that you use from starter content, you copy into your labs directory so that you have that access. That stuff will get uploaded to Git, really. So labs is where we're going to set up each individual lab. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder for lab 1. Right. And then at this point, I can go ahead and create a new scene. Right now, I have an empty scene here. This is the game window like you're used to in Unity. We have a play button. You'll see some different things that you can set it to. If you had VR, you could do a VR setup. And then build is going to build, excuse me, build the lighting for the game. The settings are going to have things that are set up for the project editor. So we have world settings, which will, set up things about the way the game is loaded and the sort of the game classes. And then we have project settings. Here we'll be able to get to things about like user input and things like that are going to be like on a project basis. All right, so now that we have, you have an understanding of here, we're going to go ahead and create a new scene. And, I can do this in a lot of different ways. I could, basically right click here and I could say a new level. In Unreal, these are called levels, not scenes. I also teach Unity, so I go back and forth between these. So we're going to say new level, and I'm just going to call this level Lab 1. And now I'm going to have a blank level. Okay, now that's okay, but I kind of would like to have some stuff that's in here by default. And as it's set, it doesn't have anything. So I'm not crazy about that. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to say, file, new level instead. And if I do that, it gives me these defaults for me to set up. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this default because then it gives me sort of a platform to run and to work on. And it makes things a little bit easier by setting up some of the background and sky so I can actually see what's going on instead of just having a dark void in the background. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this level. And then I'm going to save this one. And then make sure I save it in the right location. Lab 1. It's called new map, and I'm just going to call it Lab 1. So now I have this set up. What you'll notice over here is the world outliner, and the world outliner is basically what you have in Unity, except that you can create folders, you can do a little bit more organization than you're used to in Unity, which is kind of nice. And then the details is basically your inspector pane. So you'll see a transform. You've seen this in Unity, and all sorts of things that are set up for it. I had clicked on this, which is why we're seeing like the static mesh and the materials and physics and collision and so on and so forth. So this will set up everything on in the game. This will show me all the details so I can get those things set up. So let's go ahead and look at like adding an object. Well, if I look over to the left, what I have are some ways to add elements to this scene here. So an empty actor will just create a basic empty actor. This won't be visible in the scene, but it'll just exist in the scene. And I can add characters, pawns. Pawns are sort of the base class of things that can be controlled. And these things right here are just static meshes, so they're useful especially for testing and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the static mesh. I just clicked on it and drug it over. And then, I'm going to hit play here just so you can get an idea of what's going to happen. And you'll see that I can move, I have basically first person control of my game and the sphere is in my game. So by default, Unity is going to determine, where your camera is and where your views are. Those can all be changed through various things. Like here's the player start. And if I click on that, we'll see, oh, look, that's where the player is. That's why I started where I was. Light sources, floor. There's all sorts of things that you can set up. If I want to customize these objects, just like I did in Unity, what I can do is, select the object, and then I can click on Add Blueprint or Add Script. So this is how we do the scripting in Unreal, unlike Unity. This is going to be a visual programming language, right? Up here in my view, we also have different ways to set things up. You may have gone through the videos, but if you didn't, you can look to see what the settings are. But they will set up things like, do I want a perspective view or a different kind of, orthographic view? Do I want, a wireframe mode, or do I want, it to be lit, that sort of thing. And then these values will change sort of how you're able to select objects and the sort of things that we can do to them. So I have this object selected, and then I can, rotate it, and I'll get my rotation. And you notice that these have letters associated with them, so they have shortcut keys. Basically, if you put your fingers on the QWER location, it will let you switch between transform, rotation, and scaling pretty easily. These are just little shortcuts. The other thing that I can change are things like, what my grid looks like, snapping of objects to the grid. So if I want to make sure that they're aligned properly, I can do that. But it's sort of worth watching the videos, especially with like laying out things, because they give you some ideas and some shortcuts for how to, align objects and stuff like that. So I'm going to go ahead and add a blueprint to this object. And again, I'm going to make sure I add it to the right location. And yes, sphere blueprint is fine. So I'll say create blueprint. And this is going to pop up another window. If you have two monitors, it's really good to put your blueprints in another monitor. But I only have one demoed here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag it to my tab here. The nice thing about blueprints is that you'll see that I can, when I play these blueprints, I can see what what code is being executed. And so it'll give me an idea of what's going on. Okay, now this blueprint right here is showing me what the component is, and this is showing me the actual object itself. And this is basically what we're going to see in the viewport. So if I wanted to add things to this blueprint, if I wanted to add like objects that are attached to it or different components, I can sort of construct them all here in this blueprint. And then I have these different tabs here. So this is the viewport tab. My construction script will tell me like what happens when the object is created. So if I need to like initialize things. And then my event graph is where most of the work is going to happen. Just to be obvious what I'm doing, I'm right-clicking in my graph here to allow me to sort of move it around. And so begin play is exactly what's going to happen when you start. Okay, when your object gets loaded into the scene and gets started. And then here's the tick. Event. This gets called every frame that's going to be drawn to the screen, and so I can fire off events or things like that, actions and function calls and stuff like that when ticks happen. So I can set up my components here. Here under this little My Blueprint tab, I have an Add New. This lets me add things to my event graph specifically, so I can add various kinds of events. Functions, if I want to add a function, I can do that. And they'll show up in different places depending on how I add them. Most often what we're doing is that we're adding variables or things like that that need to store information that we can read and write from. Okay, so it's from here that when we print something, when we hit play, we can see what's actually happening. in our setup. So what I'm going to do is just sort of drag a wire out of here. So I'm left clicking and then dragging. Okay. And like that. And then I can decide what's going to happen next. One thing to notice is that this context sensitive checkbox is marked, and this will make whatever I'm typing in here, whatever I'm putting in here, be related to whatever can happen off of this kind of event. So this little like white box here is called the execute wire, and it sort of indicates what sequence things are going to happen in our blueprints. So if I drag a wire off to it, then I can say what's going to happen. Well, I am not sure what I want to have happen, so I'm going to say I'm going to print a string. Okay, and let's see what happens when I do that. I'm going to get this box here, and then I get to say what my string is. I'm going to say hello world. Now this is telling you it's only going to happen in development. And the reason is that this is a way to add sort of debug messages to your screen. So it's very useful kind of quality of life sort of thing. So every tick, I'm going to print hello world onto the screen, and you'll see what happens when I do that. I'm going to compile it really quick, and now I'm going to hit play. And then what I see is that I have my viewport here. I can look around, but what's happening is hello world is being printed over and over again. But the other important thing to notice is that I see the execution that's happening here. So I can see, when conditions are happening and when they're not. And that's probably the most important part about being able to debug your blueprints, because you'll get a mess of wires and it's hard to tell what's happening. So always make sure you're running your scripts kind of from here, and then you can go through your game and you can play it in this little mini viewport the same way that you would play, in your main viewport. If you have two windows, it's easier because then, you'll see the game playing in this viewport. If I hit play here and then come back over here, I can see that my blueprint is running. Okay. So that gives you an idea on how to start with blueprints.